Hello and welcome to another episode of the Magical World of G. Michael Vasey podcast series. This one featuring author and researcher into life after death and reality, Anthony Peake. Now, I've known Anthony for quite some time because I met him several years ago when he asked me to review his first book, Is There Life After Death? And that was a wonderful piece of work. And since then I've kept in touch. I haven't spoken to him for a couple of years, so it was good to catch up with him in this interview and find out where he's at with some of the theories that he developed. I think you'll find this absolutely fascinating, and who knows, maybe it will give you hope that in fact there is life after death. Here's Anthony.
Right. Well, for a start off, as you probably know, in terms of my work, I take a very subtle but crucial difference to a lot of the survivalist schools, in that I argue that we are confusing two elements here. When we talk about life after death, we're talking about two things that we're really not sure what they are. The two crucial words are life and after. Now, life, we're not sure what it is. We're not sure what consciousness is. We have no idea how the brain creates consciousness through inanimate matter effectively reacting with electrical impulses in the brain. We also don't know the location of consciousness necessarily. But also, the question is after. To say somebody survives after death, I would argue, is where we get lost in the argument. Because for me, before and after are relative terms because they're chronological. They take place in time. Mm-hmm. But we all know that within our own perceptual world, time is extremely elastic. We know that time can dilate when we're under pressure and everything else, or it can shrink right down. And I'd argue that what happens is that at the point of death, we fall out of time. Our subjective time perception changes, and we exist in an ever-decreasing chronon of time. David Finkelberg was the physicist that came up with the idea of the quantum of time, and he called it a chronon. Mm-hmm. And the idea that we exist in smaller and smaller pieces of time. But relative to our own subjective perception, that time element is endless. It's eternal. So therefore, at the point of death, we enter another form of consciousness. And being me, I do the physics, I do the quantum mechanics, and I do the supporting material for this. Mm-hmm. And I'm becoming more and more interested these days. I'm working very closely with a group of researchers at Imperial College and at the University of Greenwich, who are doing research into the role of dimethyltryptamine within the brain, and effectively how dimethyltryptamine also brings about these temporal changes in consciousness.
And do you still propose the IMAX type experience as well?
Yeah, very much so.
Can you explain
that? Yeah. Effectively, just rolling back many years ago, Raymond Moody, one of the founders of the near-death experience research school, published a book, I think it was in 1973, called Life After Life. And in this, he proposed a series of what he called the traits, which are near-death experience traits, really, that people generally report takes place when they have a near-death experience. Mm-hmm. Now, again, semantically, the operatives here are near-death. It's not after death, it's near-death. Nobody's ever been clinically dead and never come back. There's arguments as to where death is, and in my new book on near-death experiences, I'm discussing how this works and the latest research on the borderline between death and life. But one of the tropes he discusses in it is something called the panoramic life review. Yeah. Now, the panoramic life review is the old statement of my life passed before my eyes. So many people state, that I was dying and suddenly I was back in my childhood, or I saw a series of images of my life flashing before my eyes, or I relived my whole life in this period. Now, this intrigued me when I first started researching my first book, and I looked more into it, and I became fascinated by the relationship between the panoramic life review, as we believe it, and the implications of another phenomenon that 70% of human beings experience at least once in their life, which is déjà vu. Mm-hmm. So I was intrigued, could I link the two things together in some way? Were they related? And I came to the conclusion that yes, they were. And the panoramic life review, I believe, is a snapshot of what happens in what I call an RDE, a real death experience. Because in an NDE, what actually takes place is you don't die. So the panoramic life review happens in a split second. It's metaphorically like somebody plays, you have a whole recording of your life, and somebody inside you, which I call the daemon, which we can go into later, realizes you're not actually going to die. And it set everything up for you to live your life again in this panoramic 3-dimensional version of your life. and it realizes you're not dying. So it metaphorically presses the fast forward and goes, oh,
Right.
shoot, the person's not dying. What have I done wrong? Oh, God, I've got to get through it. So it presses it, and you either get a series of sequences or you get the super flow fast. Now, what I argue in is a real death experience. You enter a virtual reality holographic version of your life. And you begin your life again. From the moment of your birth, you live your life again. Now, there's profoundly strong evidence for this from very unrelated areas. Like, for instance, there's a guy called Barry Riceberg, who has a hypothesis he calls retrogenesis. And he had noticed, he's a doctor, and he had noticed that the decline of individuals when they have Alzheimer's or they decline into old age, there are certain physiological things that happen to the body and the brain. And he discovered that the complete reverse happens at birth and during gestation. They're mirror images of each other.
Right.
It's as if they are both the same thing in a kind of mirror image. Like, for instance, I tested this in my mother. My mother was dying of Alzheimer's. And when she was getting near death, I tested something with her. It's called a Babinski reflex. And what the Babinski reflex is that when a baby is born, just after birth, if you stroke the bottom of the foot, now I can never remember whether the foot goes inwards or outwards, but suffice to say, this Babinski reflex stops after a few weeks. I tested it with my mother as she was declining into death, and she was started with Babinski. So clearly, what Riceberg is arguing, you're going back into the womb.
It's like an arc. Life is like an arc.
Correct. It is. It's starting again. You know, there's that wonderful depiction. There's a picture where you see an old person going through their life and they roll down and then suddenly they're reborn again. Now, what I argue is that, yes, it's rebirth, it's reincarnation, but it is literally reincarnation. It's not reincarnation back as somebody else in the distant past or as somebody else. It's reincarnation as yourself. Now, the analogy works particularly effectively these days because we now understand the role of virtual reality. We can put on virtual reality headsets and we can be transported into a three-dimensional representation of three-dimensional reality. Yeah. And I believe what takes place is the brain draws up information from the 0-point field, the information field that backs up the whole universe, what Irvin Laszlo calls the Akashic field. Yeah. And I argue that everything that we perceive, including this conversation now, is actually generated in a way that it's non-physical. It's generated out of information. It's generated out of digital information that's encoded within the universe itself. And I'll come into that and the science of that in a little bit more, because all of this is backed by science. And the idea is that, can you imagine a scenario that there is a virtual reality game of your life?
I can.
And the virtual reality game has programmed within it the outcome of every possible decision you can ever make in your life. So literally, let's use the analogy. I'm playing Tomb Raider. Switch Tomb Raider on. And what happens is I'm playing the game. And as I turn the game on, poof, a little sprite appears on my screen. And it's a little Lara Croft. Now, that Lara Croft on screen, I call the Eidolon. It's an in-game consciousness that only exists once. That in-game consciousness is guided by the game player. So what happens is the game player switches the game on. And the Lara Croft, the game player has Lara Croft walk down a corridor. The game player doesn't know the environment, goes into a room and there's a monster in there and Lara Croft gets killed. So that Eidolon is dead. But what happens then is that the daemon, which is the game player, suddenly knows a little bit about the environment and the game. So it restarts the game again. A new Eidolon is born with no memories of the past life except what is carried in the brain of the daemon, which is playing the game. Goes towards the room and suddenly has an inkling it shouldn't go in that room because it's dangerous. So it moves on further down the corridor and gets eaten again. So imagine a scenario, we live our lives like this, that we are exploring all the avenues and all the corridors and all the objectives and outcomes of a super game that we're existing in. And every time the game is played, the daemon has more knowledge about the environment. Now, the daemon is the immortal you. The daemon is your higher self, for want of a better term. And this is how the higher self guide you through your life. You know, one of the questions people talk about the higher self, and I know from, groups we've been involved in, like the Servants of the Light and things, the way in which there's the concept of the higher self. It's within esoteric traditions. But nobody except myself has ever explained how the higher self knows what to do. And the higher self knows what to do because it's lived your life before. So it is in this position that it's almost exploring. Let's have Gary do this time. Let's have him move to the Czech Republic or Chechnya, how you call it now. Let's have him explore that avenue of his life this time round. Mm-hmm. And if it works out, I'll pursue that a bit further. And if it doesn't work out, I'll have him emigrate to Australia, or I'll do all of these alternatives.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Is there a possibility, because as I think I've told you before, and I certainly have mentioned it numerous times on this podcast, that when I was a little boy, I had an experience where I thought I was plugged into a machine, experiencing my life in a virtual reality machine. This would be 1965, 66. I didn't know it was virtual reality, but I do now. And I was in a corridor filled with rooms, little rooms with lots of people all hooked into machines like this. So this idea resonates well with me. It also resonates with the sort of occult know thyself mantra, which is, it's all about life and experience is all about knowing who you are, learning who you are. You can only do that through experience, right? Mm-hmm. So the question I was going to ask, though, was, is it possible that when you kick the bucket, die, your consciousness just jumps to another sprite in the game rather than is reborn? Do you follow what I'm saying? Because I've had this crazy idea at times that, maybe who I am now is the surviving consciousness of multiple, n numbers of lives. And every time my life comes to an end, my consciousness jumps to a surviving sprite. And I don't know why, but I have this idea and have. Well,
that's literally, the old Platonic idea of the transmigration of souls, and the idea that, and of course, this is the central precept of reincarnation as it's generally understood within Vedanta and within Buddhism. Now, I argue, and I've refined this idea a lot, so I don't know if I've ever necessarily discussed this with you, but in my last book, Cheating the Ferryman, I refine this a lot more, because what I argue is, and ordinarily I try to stay with the science and I try to stay with the logic. So my mantra has always been, if I can't find scientific support for this, I'm on a dodgy wicket, because I'm starting to go into suppositions. Yeah. So everything I've said thus far is supported by the science. It's supported by the growing interest these days in something called the holographic universe, and the idea of how information is discovered to have physicality. Yep. The way in which information is effectively sprawled on the edge of a black hole, this kind of information. So all the science is there. So when people are saying, what the hell is he talking about? The science is there. Believe me, if you read my books, the science is there. But I'm starting to move into areas of philosophical applications of this. And I'm particularly interested in the idea, and I have what I now call I used to call it the daemon eidolon dyad, but I've now broadened this out. And what I believe is taking place is that there is the eidolon that lives one life. Then there is the daemon that lives multiple lives of the same eidolon, the same environment that the eidolon is born in. So in other words, you have a computer game and Lara Croft only does her adventures in Cambodia, for instance. And within that game, she never leaves Cambodia. She's always there. But I argue that there is a daemon, and then there is the daemon. But I then have what I call a concept I call the uber daemon. And the uber daemon is my equivalent of the Jungian collective unconscious. It is the repository of all the records, all the games, for want of a better term, of the whole of humanity. Right. Mm-hmm. And that entity is as much a singular entity as we are. It is a collection of ideas. And this is what happens, I think.
Mind of God.
Well, no, it gets more refined.
Oh, really?
Okay. Because this is still the repository of all human knowledge. Uh-huh. And this entity, the uber daemon, is where people go when they have hypnotic regression and they go back to other lives. They regress back, and then they find that they're a peasant living in France in the 17th century. Now, nobody's understood the mechanism of how that works. I argue I can give
I was going to ask you that, because it's great, yeah.
Yeah, so I can give a theoretical model to how this works, because what happens is your subconscious. What happens is, and I've studied hypnotism and how hypnotism works, and how it seems it dives into subliminal memories. And I think what takes place is in the hypnotic trance state, consciousness moves up out of the eidolonic state into the demonic state. and then from the demonic state into the uber demonic state. And when it's there, it literally randomly attunes into a signal, a story, some digital information about another human being's life in the past. And it's catapulted into that life, and it brings that up from the Akashic field, from the Akashic record, via the microtubules in the brain. Because I even go to the point of how this process works within the brain, because there's a massive problem with science as to the location of memory. Nobody's been able to find where memory is located. We know where it's processed. It's probably the hippocampus and to do with the temporal lobes, but we don't know where the information lies. I mean, Carl Pribram and Carl Lashley particularly spent his whole career trying to find the location of memory in the brain, enneagrams, and he failed. And in the end, he came to the conclusion that memory was all over the brain, always being drawn up from somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so then you go into the Uber Daemon's worldview, and it's the Jungian collective unconscious, and it ties in very much with Jung's model of this. But I then argue that above the Uber Daemon is something I call the Go-Daemon, God Daemon, okay? Mm-hmm. And the Go-Daemon is the conscious awareness of everything that is. It is the repository of the information field that everything is created from. Everything is created from information. We know this from quantum mechanics and quantum physics. And we know that consciousness is prime. Consciousness creates matter. We know from the twin slit experiment and various other things in quantum mechanics that there's a relationship between the act of observation and the existence of subatomic particles. So this is the over-consciousness. Now, within esoteric traditions and within religious traditions, there's even terminology for it. In the Kabbalah, it's called the Or Ein Sof. Mm-hmm. Within esoteric Islam, there's a term that's escaped me, but there's a term within esoteric Islam and Sufism for the same thing. And this ultimately is the collective of everything. And that is what we say when we say we are one consciousness experiencing subjectively. Now, many people will turn around and say, oh, this is the Bill Hicks monologue, the very famous Bill Hicks monologue. Do you know the one?
No, can't say.
Okay, it's brilliant. It's really, really funny. He's doing a monologue on stage, and he turns around and he's pretending he's a newscaster. And he's going and he said, oh, breaking news. Young man on acid discovers that all matter is energy just moved down to a slower speed. And we're all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. That's interesting. Oh, it's a bill for the weather. And it's the way he does it. Check it out. It's very popular. There's so many websites and YouTube channels show this monologue. Right. But I argue he's quite right. This is what he means. This is the inner truth. But you know from your knowledge of esoteric tradition,
this all fits. I mean, it definitely all fits. And in fact, I wanted to before we go too much further, I wanted to also share something that I've long pondered and now think maybe fits very well into your hypothesis, which is that I grew up in Hull, and I had a couple of friends who were next door neighbours and went through school with them. One was a year older than me. I won't mention his name, but we were friendly, and but he had quite a point to prove, and one day he lost his temper with me, and he beat me up pretty well. And I avoided him after that. He had a nasty temper. And then I lost contact as I left school and went to college. I lost contact with him. I moved to the States and found out he was actually a senior vice president with a company in Indianapolis. So we reconnected and we spent some conversations on the phone and stuff and said we'd meet, but we never did. And we kind of connected on Facebook in that era. And then one day, out of the blue, I got a telephone call from him. And he says, hey, Gary, he says, I just wanted to say that I'm so sorry for beating you up that day when we were kids. I said, well, hell, I've just about forgotten all about it. It's irrelevant. Of course I forgive. Will you forgive me? I said, of course. And 2 days later, he dropped down dead unexpectedly at the age of 56. And I came to discover when I talked to some other people that had grown up in that area, he'd called many of his old school colleagues, work colleagues, and literally apologized for everything bad he'd done to them. In the few weeks before he passed away, he almost, even though his death was sudden, unexpected, he seemed to know it was coming.
That is, it's so common I've discovered this with some of my friends. It's as if your daemon is preparing you, knowing you're about to move on, and you're making your reparations. You're saying sorry. You've realized that within this iteration of what I call the Bohmian IMAX, which is the concept of it's the term I use for the program we're within, that the daemon, because the daemon can communicate with you on occasions. It depends on how open your doors of perception are. And I wrote a book called Opening the Doors of Perception to try and explain this neurologically.
I have it.
Oh, good. Thank you. And the idea is, that you will sense, or you will know. I always love the word inkling, which is an old English term. And it is that kind of sense of something. It's as if it's in your periphery vision, but you just sense something is going to happen. And I was intrigued, funnily enough, and this is, again, an interesting aside, is that J.R.R. Tolkien and his group of C.S. Lewis and various other individuals, Owen Barfield, I think was somebody else, when they were together as students, they had a society they call the Inklings.
Yes.
And of course, if you read, there is a fascinating book by God, I don't know, my memory sometimes I find it weird. Verily,
that's the problem.
No, the opposite. Verily Flieger. And Verily Flieger wrote a book on Tolkien. I haven't read it for years, and I was thinking I'm never going to remember that name of the book, and I did. And in it, she discusses Tolkien's fascination with the eternal return and the eternal recurrence. And this is, again, of course, we know that if the technical term for what I'm talking about here is the eternal return or the eternal recurrence, which has been something that has been part of esoteric traditions and has been part of philosophical discourse since the Stoics. And we know that the Gnostics were particularly interested in this idea of circularity and return. We know Nietzsche, when he wrote about it. But in my latest book, I have a section. It wasn't just Nietzsche. Nietzsche was part of a whole school of German romantics and French philosophers who were writing about this particular concept in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. So this is, I believe, that the concept of that we live our lives again and that we use that knowledge to progress is a central knowledge of a lot of esoteric traditions, and that when you get to the higher levels of these esoteric traditions, that's what you're taught. Like, for example, one of the most famous writers, well, whether he's famous, he is in certain circles, on this subject of living your life over and over again, is Peter Ouspensky.
Yeah.
And of course, what's fascinating about Peter Ouspensky is his full name is Peter Diminovich Ouspensky, because the name daemon ran through his family alternate. You were Peter Diminovich, or you were Daemon Peterovich within his family. And he wrote a series of books on this and on the fascination of the eternal return. And in fact, he spent because he sensed he was dying, just like your friend. Ouspensky sensed he was dying, and because he was like me, we didn't believe, but the evidence seemed to point to the fact that we live our lives over and over again. He spent the last few weeks or months of his life traveling around the south of England, where he then lived and had lived for 40 years, reliving his memories. Because he knew he was going back, and he knew that he needed it. And this is what he did. And Gary Lachman discusses this in his book on Ouspensky. And also there's various other books on Ouspensky and his interest in this. But of course, many people will be turning around and saying, well, of course, this is the movie Groundhog Day. And of course it is. Groundhog Day is probably, there are two movies. I've always argued that Cheating the Ferryman and The Eternal Return and my concepts, people subliminally know they're true. And what they do is it sits within the zeitgeist. It sits just below, probably at the uber daemon level. People are aware of this. But it's like, again, an inkling. They're not sure. So they write them in fictions. And the amount of movies that have come out over recent years that use this theme specifically, even movies that you don't expect it to be, such as what was the movie were they Arrival? Arrival, she's living her life again. She's living in the Bohmian IMAX, and the clues are all the way through the film, where you realize that she's recognizing the life of her daughter, which you believe in the movie is something that happened in her past. It's something that's about to happen to her in the future. We then know Kurt Vonnegut used to write about the idea. They had the Transformadorians, I think, were people who knew you lived your life over and over again. You then have Vanilla Sky, the movie.
Yeah.
Again, if I'm telling anybody, if you're interested here, I don't know if I've frozen for you, but have
You're
I
frozen? Yeah.
Okay. It keeps happening. I noticed with you, but you tend to notice that what happens is, it happened to me a couple of days ago when I was recording one of my interviews. And what happens is it writes itself. The recording is fine. Right. It might look like I'm frozen, but the recording is fine.
Okay.
So don't worry. I found out how it's worked. But that the where was I? Yeah, in Vanilla Sky, which was based upon a Spanish film called Open Your Eyes. If you have it on DVD, fast forward to the end where the central character, David Ames, who's taken off by Tom Cruise,
yeah,
he jumps off the top of the building.
Yeah.
When he starts to jump, freeze frame it and start to go frame by frame. And what you'll see is a series of photographs of somebody's life. And those photographs are of the life of Cameron Crowe, the director. Again, panoramic life review, end of life. His life is flashing before his eyes. Right. And in that movie, all the way through the movie, he's always saying, isn't he, I'm living the dream.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of people have that same perception. And I don't think, I think there's two ways you can live in a dream. One is you're kind of an automaton and not really thinking very much and just wandering through life aimlessly. But I think also you can have a purposeful life and then realize that somehow you're living a dream too. And I've had some weird dreams. I had a dream, maybe I told you before, but I had a dream once where I could see metadata, and everything had metadata tagged with it, and I could see this metadata. So instantly I could see the inside out of everything because it had the data attached. And I think these dreams sometimes sort of echo or guess at what reality is as well.
Well, again, I suppose one could argue that, and I do argue that dreams are one of the areas by which the daemon can communicate with the eidolon.
Yeah.
And precognitive dreams are a particular example of how this can happen.
Let me ask you a question. Where is science at with regard to consciousness? Because there's a push to man-machine, artificial intelligence, conscious machines, this kind of thing. So there must be a push on to look at what consciousness is. Has it made any progress at all?
Well, the issue is, and by the way, people will notice that there's been a subtle change in my background, which is to do with a subtle Archon attack we just had, which people who watch my programs will know this happens regularly and we're quite used to it. So just to explain, there's a massive issue at the moment in terms of an interest in what consciousness is and whether we have any idea or understanding of consciousness. Now, way back in the mid-1990s, a young Australian philosopher by the name of David Chalmers stood up at the University of Arizona and said that science has two challenges in terms of things it needs to understand. That it's got the soft problem, which is understanding how the brain works, and then there is the hard problem. And the hard problem is understanding how consciousness is facilitated or created in the brain. Now, this is a massive issue and a massive problem to science, and has been and still is. And the problem is, where does consciousness come from? How is consciousness processed? Now, if you read any books on neurology, they will argue that consciousness is simply, and I mean simply is not the right term, is literally an epiphenomenon of brain complexity. So the more complex a system is, something new just appears within the system. I've used the analogy in one of my books. It's rather like water. You take hydrogen. You take a single molecule of atom of hydrogen and two molecules of oxygen. No, two of hydrogen and one of oxygen. You put them together, and when they're separate, they are gases. But you put the two together, and suddenly wetness appears.
Mm-hmm. And
that effectively is like an epiphenomenon of chemistry. And they argue that there's something similar happens in the brain, that the complexity happens, then poof, just from nowhere, consciousness appears. Now, anybody who is conscious, and of course, it's the problem of other minds, I can't tell whether anybody else is really conscious, and I can't philosophically. You could all be what's called zombies, and I'm the only person that actually thinks. But if we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, that is true. But So we have the idea of that this complexity works, but the richness of our conscious experience is not just we are processing stimuli. We have history, we have memories, we have feelings, we have emotions. All of these things seem to spontaneously just appear when these chemicals come together with electricity in the brain. And I argued in one of my earlier books, it's like the addition, how does it happen? Is it the addition of one molecule? And suddenly one molecule is added to it all. And suddenly consciousness just spontaneously from nowhere just appears, which makes absolutely no sense. As many philosophers have said, and sensible scientists have said, consciousness and physical matter, they are completely different things. Mm. Consciousness has no extension in space. Rex extension, I think Descartes said. It doesn't have any extension in space. It cannot be measured. When people turn around and say consciousness can be measured, no, you can measure electrical activity in the brain, but that's not consciousness. It's right. Electrical activity. So, there's nothing within that electrical activity that has the richness of the sense of red, or a love of the music of Mozart, or the memories that we have. It's inadequate on so many levels. So what they're really suffering again is the massive hubris. Now, if you read books, there have been many hubristic books written in recent years about consciousness. Daniel Dennett leaps to mind. He wrote a book called Consciousness Explained, which must be the most hubristic statement ever made. And Dennett just argues that there is no inner life. We are fooling ourselves into thinking we're even conscious. We are, there's nothing going on inside. There's nothing. We're just being. Now, as I've argued in one of my books, I can't fool a stone into thinking anything. You can only fool something if it's sentient. You can only fool somebody by showing them a magician's trick and they see it and process it mentally and say, oh, look at that magician's trick. Isn't that amazing? And they get fooled. So how can something that is not sentient and not conscious be fooled by anything? It is utterly ridiculous. The concept, by the way, that I'm dissing here is called eliminative materialism. So then we extrapolate the question from that and say, well, how do we then apply that to artificial intelligence? And it's something that the software engineers call the substrate problem. It's the same problem of how could it happen? And even more importantly, how could you ever know? There are various tests. The Turing test is one of the things that they think that they can use to try and see if self-referential consciousness is there. But we can't. We will never know. If I can't prove that you're conscious to the extent of really knowing, epistemologically knowing, how can we ever know whether something, they could be programmed to react in certain ways? This is why people are being fooled at the moment by AI, because AI is programmed to give the impression that it's reacting to feedback.
I call it intelligent plagiarism.
Very good. It is, isn't it?
Yes. It's nothing more. It's not artificial intelligence. It's intelligent plagiarism by machine. But it's interesting because in the work that I've been doing, and in some of the interviews I've done on this podcast recently, Veda Austin, for example, talking about water. Have you come across Veda's work?
No, I haven't.
She's a lady in New Zealand, and she freezes water after giving it some thought. And she captures images in the ice that reflect the thought. If you go to a website, it's full of patterns. If you watch the podcast, in fact, I actually post some pictures. But for example, a tree, and the ice formed from the water will be in the shape of a tree. And she's done this so much that she's recognized what she calls hydroglyphs, which are messages, a language of water. And so somehow water is either conscious or reflects our consciousness. Now, when I'm dowsing here...
There's a Japanese guy called Emoto that came up with something similar.
Exactly, it's a similar, yeah. When I'm dowsing here, well, I've been doing this for 4 years or 5 years now, and I've realized that, in fact, I must already know where these earth energy lines are subconsciously, but not consciously. Because the number of times that I go somewhere, know that a line has a certain azimuth. Now it can bend and has sinuous patterns, but I know it's azimuth. So I can guess pretty much on a road or a footpath where I might find that line again. And then I don't, because it has switched direction. And I get in the car and I drive and I'm puzzling around, where could it be? I'm dowsing in the car, I give up, I park the car to have another look at the map. and I've parked in the damn line. And this happens over and over and over again, plus lots of other examples that I've just documented in my last book. And so I suddenly realized, I had this sort of, just sudden realization, hang on a minute, I know where these lines are, but not consciously. And I have to use one of these to get a conscious impression of where my unconscious mind is telling me that line is. That's why I call it the web of weird, the web spun by the fate, the three fates, the sisters of fate. And then I follow some of these lines and discover that where they go is important to me as a person or to someone else. So I'll just a quick example that people are familiar with. My daughter had an exam at school to enter a school. It was raining. I wanted to wait for her. I was bored, so I got out and started dowsing. I found that this major line ran through the school. I followed the line through Brynner. It went through the house she was conceived in, the hospital she was born in, the house we lived in, the park we played in. And it actually took changes in direction to do that. So I call that line Denny's line because it just seems to reflect her life. I had a girlfriend who was working with me for a time, and we were tracking another line, and she was staying in her son's in-laws' house for the weekend when I picked her up, because they were waiting on a house being built. We discovered the line went through that house, through the site 16 kilometers away where he was building a house, through the church they got married in, and through the hunting lodge in the middle of the forest where they had their reception. So it was like somehow intimately associated with her son and his fate and his lifeline. And so, Anthony, it's like all of a sudden you start to think, hang on a minute, what the hell is going on here? There's something going on that's about consciousness. And then I went to this major earth center where multiple lines node at this point on a hill called Svarti. And I just had the opportunity to sort of go in and meditate alone. And because there was a big organ player, there was a big organist thing, and he was rehearsing. It was so noisy. And I decided to stand in this Earth Energy Center and do what is pore breathing. So imagine that I'm breathing in through all the pores in my body and breathing out through all the pores in my body, the energies. And I swear it was the most amazing experience of my entire life. I was one. Everything was one. I could hear everybody talking. I could feel everything, see everything. And it lasted just a fraction of a second. And I had to reach out because I thought I was floating away and falling. And so, this avenue that I've gone down is like speaking volumes about consciousness and how we seem to somehow, through expectation, perhaps we create our own reality, but it speaks back to us through synchronicities, feathers falling from the sky, liminal people that are there one minute and gone the next. It is a bizarre universe that we live in. And I think that the work that you're doing is really, and others like you, is really key, because I've got this gut feeling that we're at like some critical point in humanity's evolution where we're going too far in this direction of deconstructionist, materialist, and nothing exists that I can't touch and feel. And in fact, we've gone backwards. 2,000 years ago, they knew these lines were there. They built their churches on them. They built their sites on them. They were more mind and consciousness focused than we are. And if we're not careful, we'll end up half machines, mindless beings, robots, instead of the godlike creatures that we really are. So I think that people that are using science and scientific method, real scientific method, not, believe it or I'll cancel you, but I'm open to debate, I'll argue with you, let's have a debate, because that's what science is. Like yourself, I think you're doing humanity a favor, because if we don't address this soon, we could end up in a horrible situation. That's my view. We need to go back to connecting with the land and thinking about mind and consciousness. Imagine if in 4 years of using dowsing rods, I can do the things I can do now, dowsing, which is ask questions, get answers that are always correct, like where is the line? Is it less than half a kilometer? Is it less than 100 meters? Is it male? Is it female? Where does it go? If it only took me 4 years of partial training to be able to do that, imagine if I went to school and college and got a PhD in mind, what I could do, what we could do as a species.
Well, I think there was so much wisdom in the things you were saying there, and it so much resonates with me. And, lest we forget, you are a PhD qualified scientist.
Absolutely, yeah.
So you are not And, the audience need to realize this, because I'm not sure whether you necessarily broadcast that fact, but you are. It's not as if, that anybody that's out there that wants to diss this and saying, oh, they're just two pair of wackos that really don't know what they're talking about. That is incorrect. And I think you're right. I sometimes feel that we have gone along the wrong track. I call it Heath Robinson science. It's the idea of we seem to be preoccupied with two things. We want the evidence that the world is telling us and what scientific investigation is telling us, and we want to shoehorn it into a particular paradigm that we're comfortable with. And what we're doing is we are playing with words. I mean, again, in many of my talks, many of my lectures, I discuss how science seems to be preoccupied with the descriptors of things. And by describing something and giving it a name, we therefore have explained it. It's like it is an hallucination. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I call it idiopathic science, the idea that we think we understand something because we've named it. And of course, we don't. And I sometimes suspect that what's happened with quantum mechanics is that we've been so determined to shoehorn it into the materialist reductionist paradigm that we've completely missed the point.
Yeah.
And that we're off there on a branch and another branch and another branch off here, whereas the actual truth is over here. And we need to have a huge paradigm leap. And I think the first thing we need to do with the paradigm leap is acknowledge the one thing that we do know with absolute certitude is that we are sentient, and that so we have something inside our heads, which is consciousness. And as long as we just pretend, because we can't physically measure it, that it doesn't exist, it's like pretending that precognition doesn't happen. One of the things that drives me crazy is that I'll do events with skeptics, and we'll have a debate and everything else, and they will be dissing my ideas and everything else. And then we go for a drink afterwards, and we sit and have a few beers, and I wait for it. And it always happens. And one of the scientists will go, I don't agree with anything you say, but once this happened to me, and they'll explain this incredible story. And I'll sit there and go, right, so that did not change in any way your worldview. And the answer is always, I cannot address that because I have academic tenure and I cannot be seen to be advocating these things. So you just pretend it doesn't happen. That's not science, that's scientism.
No. Yeah, there is some real science going on still, but I think it's increasingly difficult to do real science because it's now more about, well, it always has been about egos and personalities, just like the esoteric side. And I remember when I published my first paper, it was rejected by the Canadian Journal of Earth Sciences, and I couldn't figure out why. It was written with a university professor in Canada. It was just a short piece, a descriptive piece about a significant discovery in the fossil record in Canada. So I resubmitted it to a different publication, and they published it. And then we figured out what went wrong. Another professor at another university wrote in an angry letter saying, but we discovered that first. How dare Vasey and Zodra publish before we did? And he was on the board of the other journal, so he suppressed my work because he felt it was his discovery. And so we got into a pissing match about who discovered it. And of course, none of us discovered it. It was a student of my co-writer that had discovered it 4 or 5 years previously. And this taught me, forget peer-reviewed. Nonsense. Peer-reviewed means nothing. It's just bullshit.
Well, it's human beings. You can't take human beings out of this. That human beings are petty, they're ambitious and everything else. But the major issue here is, and it's the elephant in the room as well, is that the problem people like you and I have is we're on a bridge. We're on the bridge. And at one side are the materialist reductionists who are just wanting to dismiss anything. Then we have the crazed loonballs who believe absolute nonsense and can believe 3 or 4 completely contradictory things at the same time.
Yes.
And the scientists, they go over us. They pretend we don't exist.
Yeah.
We're the danger to them. So they will always focus in on the David Icks and the people who are making extreme statements, but they'll never address what we're talking about because they cannot deal with what we are talking about. Imagine if you and I were in a conference with these people, you with your PhD in science and me with my knowledge of quantum mechanics and neurology. People don't engage with me, and they don't engage with me because I scare the hell out of them. It's not they don't engage, they cannot. And I know nobody can take apart and point out where my hypothesis is wrong. Because I've done the science. I invest huge amounts of time.
Well, when you say you've done the science, let me explain what you mean by that. You've invited criticism, you've had debate, you've modified certain aspects of your theories based on evidence presented to you, and your theory anyway is always a hypothesis and a work in progress. So
Yes.
if something pops up that needs to be taken into consideration, you will alter and try again. And that's science. What's practiced as so-called science right now? Think about the climate thing. We're all going to die, blah, blah, blah. Basically, one group of extreme-minded scientists have taken over the climate agenda, and you can't publish anything without losing your job, being ridiculed. To disagree with them, that's not science, that's pseudoscience. And as a result of that, humanity is going down a path where, and I think this is all part of the same agenda, a carbon-based species is about to stop producing carbon. What? Are you kidding me? So we're supposed to become machines then, I take it. That's the agenda, is it? Because I'm a carbon-based animal. I breathe out CO2.
That's interesting, isn't it?
It's all part of the same. To me, it's like a big mistake. It's a big error of judgment, and it's all tied in with egos and with money and power. And you start sounding a bit like a conspiracy theorist, like a Mr. Ike. But the fact is that there is something going on in the last few years where things just seem to have gotten upside down, and I'm the magician. I'm the one that believes I can create my own reality, right? Through expectation and working with myself and consciousness. And I'm laughed at by people who want to imagine that they are a different sex and have us all agree with them. Excuse me?
There is,
I'm not criticizing them. I'm just pointing out that that's a bit ridiculous, isn't it?
There does seem to be this lack of logical thinking. There seems to be this kind of, they go so far, but then there are things you can't say or do.
Yes. And that's not science. That's not a world that we ought to be able to discuss. And it's
we should
hidden
follow
behind being offended,
it's the idea of we should follow where the facts tell us. This is what it's all about. If the fact, if I come across something that contradicts anything I've written, I will amend my writing.
Yes,
I will go back. I'm not like you. I'm not somebody trying to prove. I don't have a pet hypothesis that I then go out to try and prove. What I have is I've looked at all the information, and from the information, I've come to these possible conclusions.
Yeah.
It's the information that has drawn me to this position, rather than I believe in the world was created 6,000 years ago, like creation scientists. Therefore, I will go out and I will cherry pick the information to support my position. I have never done that, but I have been criticised by critics of me, turning around and saying, "Oh, Anthony Peake's not consistent. He changes his ideas." Well, that's how it works, mate. Sorry and all that, but if something's wrong, it's wrong.
Yeah. It's amazing, isn't it? Anyway, in terms of finding more out about Anthony Peake and your writings, where can people go?
Right, okay. In terms of my books are literally everywhere. So you can get them from libraries, you can get them. I'm amazed there's a number of university libraries that even now have my books in them. My books are in all formats, including Audible, which I had to audition to read my own books on Audible. But I'm delighted that I was allowed to do so. There's only 2 books on Audible that I haven't read. And one of them is the Philip K. Dick book, because they've decided they wanted somebody with an American accent, which I think it works very, very well. Plus my Watkins books, because they decided they didn't want to pay me for doing it. The books you can order on Amazon, you can order from bookshops. As I say, they are everywhere. In terms of, and they're all still in re-edition, new editions. None of my books have gone into a back catalogue, because they all sell comparatively well. I have a website, anthonypeake.com, which I'm not as active on as I should be, and I should be on there. If you go onto that website and you want signed copies of my books, you can order them off there. I'd put the caveat, though, but because of the cost of postage these days, particularly to America, I wouldn't advise it, because you're going to spend up more on the postage than you are on the book. So think long and hard before you do that. I'm also extremely active on Facebook. I post 2 or 3 times a day. I'm also now very active on Instagram as well. I also have my own podcast, which there are two. There's the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour, and also Incon. And these are all posted onto my YouTube channel. So just go onto YouTube and the YouTube channel. But generally, if you just want to know about my work, literally just Google me. Just go onto YouTube and put Anthony Peake in there. There's tons and tons and tons of material on there, including my recording. I did an event in Southern California earlier this summer, and that's gone ballistic and crazy in terms of the number of viewings. And it was only put up about 2 or 3 weeks now. It's already around about 30,000, I think. Good. So just check it out, check out my work, and contact me. I can't respond to everybody. And these days, more and more people are trying to contact me. And it's not because I'm ignoring you. It's just at the moment, I'm writing a new book and I'm researching a new book. And I'm doing that 9 hours a day, every day, Monday to Friday. So I'm a little bit tied up at the moment. And the new book will be out in 2025, January. And it's provisionally entitled The Near-Death Experience, The Full Story. And I'm going to literally give everybody all the information about the near-death experiences, from the science to the history. I'm actually giving myself the challenge of trying to read every single academic paper that has been written on the near-death experience in the last 30 years. And so far, I'm doing quite well. So we shall see.
Great. Well, Anthony, thanks. It was a lot of fun. Enjoyed it, and good to catch up.
Always, Gary. Always wonderful to talk to you.